To the tree lighting, annual tree lighting here at the museum, we a few years ago instituted a tradition of having a lecture prior to the regular tree lighting activities here to focus on some aspect of our Christmas traditions which have sprung up mostly during America's Guild Age. Each of you, I think, has a season program guide at your seats. You found one in your chair before you sat down. This is a guide to all of the activities we have planned here at the museum during the 2010-2011 season here in Palm Beach. This lecture is possible because of a sponsorship by Harris Private Bank. So if you happen to meet somebody from Harris Private Bank along the way in your travels this week or next or anytime in the near future, I hope you'll thank them for helping to make these kinds of things possible. We are hooked up to the internet for this lecture for a live webcast so that anybody in the world who would like to join us for this lecture can hear what you're hearing from the speaker and see the same slides that you're going to see, and then at the end of the lecture ask questions via the internet as well. So we try to take this lecture outside the ballroom, outside of Whitehall, outside of Palm Beach, and even outside of Florida, and even outside the United States to as broad an audience as we can. I want to take just a minute to remind you to turn off your cell phones, and if you happen to walk in with one of those audio tour wands, you might want to give that to one of the staff members at the back of the ballroom. You won't need it for the lecture, and sometimes the electronics we set up for the lecture set off the alarm on those audio tour wands, and those kinds of interruptions are a little bit jarring. We want to make sure our speaker has the best experience possible here at Whitehall. What else did I need? We'll start our regular tree lighting activities at 3 o'clock following this lecture, and we've listed those for you. I think each of you received a handout as you came through the gate listing the activities for the day and the timing of those activities, which culminate at 4:45 with the lighting of the Christmas tree in the Grand Hall by the youngest descendants of Henry Flagler. And in today's case, we have 4 great-great-great-grandchildren here to help light the tree and kick off our holiday season here in Whitehall. I think with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, and we'll let her tell us about a famous author and an interesting character in American history. Valerie Bennett, who is a curator of the O. Henry Museum in Austin, Texas, is here to talk to us about a guy named William Porter, that we all know better as O. Henry, who wrote one of the favorite Christmas stories, The Gift of the Magi. So without further ado, please welcome Valerie Bennett to talk to us about O. Henry.
I'm a little short, so it kind of looks... Well, first of all, you can probably guess from my accent that I'm from Texas. And I want to thank the Flagler Museum for inviting me here today, and I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place, and I'd like to mention my husband is in the audience, my support. So without further ado, thank you, and as O. Henry would say, compliments of the season. To understand Gifts of the Magi, you really have to know about O. Henry's life. So this lecture that I'm going to give will give you a real good insight into his thinking, because you'll learn about his life. First of all, let me start with the Gifts of the Magi. Persons all over the world know Gifts of the Magi. It is definitely a Christmas classic. Each year the story is retold and it's adapted for children's picture books. It has been reprinted for holiday magazines and newspapers, and even local theater companies. It's portrayed at local theater companies and on stage. It is the story of a young married couple, Della and Jim, and you see them there on the slide. They live in a small flat in New York City. It's Christmas. They have very little money. Della has saved her money by cutting back on household expenses, And she still doesn't have enough money to buy Jim that very special gift, which is a watch fob chain for his precious pocket watch. Okay. So, is that better? Yeah. So she decides that what she'll do is she'll cut her hair, and she'll sell her hair, and then she'll have the money that she needs. So she cuts her hair and she sells it, but unbeknownst to Jim, he has decided to buy Della the beautiful combs that she was eyeing in a store window. So it's Christmas Eve, they open their gifts, and they find out that they have bought each other useless items, useless gifts. He has sold his pocket watch, she has cut her hair. So it is a story, though, that O. Henry knew well. O. Henry knew what it was like to be in love, but he also knew what it was to be poor. And he knows about sacrificing something that you dearly love to provide for another person. And that's what this story is all about. So to understand O. Henry, he was born September the 11th, 1862 in Greensboro, North Carolina. His father was a medical doctor, Dr. Algernon Sidney Porter, and his mother was Mary Jane Virginia Swain. When William was only 3 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis. And so William's dad, Dr. Porter, Will, and his brother went to live with their grandmother. And William went to his Aunt Lina's school, where he learned to love literature and drawing. He loved all of the beautiful things like that. He even in a letter expressed his fondness to books to Margaret, his daughter. Years later, he wrote her a letter telling Margaret how much he loved books and how much he loved to read. And he said, "When one grows up, a thing they never regret is that they went to school long enough to learn all that they could. It makes everything easier for them, and if they like books and study, they can always content and amuse themselves that way, even if other people are cross and tiresome and the world doesn't go to suit them." So I want to show you some photographs. Here we have O. Henry as a baby. Kind of cute, nice dress. Here we have a photograph of his mother, Mary Jane Virginia Swain, and her father was actually a reporter. By the time he was 17, though, his father, Dr. Algernon Sidney Porter, thought that his son should learn medicine. Henry wasn't really too keen on that, but he went to apprentice in his Uncle Clark's drugstore in Greensboro, and that his Uncle Clark is in the center there. And he worked there. He worked there, and he even became a licensed apprentice. But that wasn't what he wanted. He wanted adventure. So when he was offered the chance to go to Texas, he took it. There were family friends, Dr. and Mrs. Hall, who had sons living in Texas. They were Texas Rangers, and they managed a ranch in Cotulla. So Henry took the train. They offered him the visit. He got on a train ride from Greensboro, North Carolina, to Texas, and it was a 2-week train ride. His first stop in Texas was Houston, and then he went on to San Antonio. And then when he got off at San Antonio, he took a buckboard to Cotulla, which was in the middle of nowhere. It still is today. It's all cacti. When he got there, he really enjoyed it, though. There was a lot to do, and as far as ranching was concerned, he listened to the stories of the Texas Rangers, and it was a wonderful experience for him. And even his stories today, you will see when you read his Western stories, there's a lot of elements about Texas and Texas Rangers. He learned about the outlaws who were roaming the West. And this is a O. Henry photograph. This is a very famous Texas photograph that we have hanging in the O. Henry Museum. And he's about 20 in that photograph there. That was actually taken when he came into Austin. And of of course, this is a book jacket cover of his Texas stories. His most famous Texas stories are Caballero's Way. Maybe some of you have heard about the Cisco Kid. The Cisco Kid was taken straight out of Caballero's Way. And it's about a ruthless outlaw in O. Henry's story. But however, the movies made the Cisco Kid into someone who was kind of the Robin Hood sort of guy. Well, he lived on the ranch for a couple of years until he had the opportunity to visit Austin. And Richard Hall, one of the Hall brothers who was managing the ranch, came to Austin on business. O. Henry came along, and when he did, Will Porter came along, and when he did, he saw that he really liked Austin. There were things to do. He was 21 years old, and there was life. There were buildings, and there were stores, and there were people, and he liked it. His first job was at Morley's drugstore. He had very good credentials as pharmacy back in North Carolina as a pharmacist, and so Morley's readily hired him, and that is a photograph of Morley's. It's still there today. The building is still on 6th Street today. It used to be called Old Con Street in downtown Austin, but now it's 6th Street. And if you go down 6th Street, you can still see the building where O. Henry was the pharmacist. However, pharmacy, like I said, it really wasn't his desire. He really didn't care for it. He quickly quit, and he went to work for Maddox Brothers, which was a real estate firm. He worked there for a few years, and then he liked it because it gave him money to do the things that he wanted to do. He loved to play poker. He liked euchre. He liked dominoes. He liked to hang around with his friends. And he was earning a little bit more money at Morley's so that he could do those sort of things. And here is a photograph of the Hill City Quartet. O. Henry was a member of the Hill City Quartet, and they serenaded the young ladies about town. His fellow members were Hillier and Long, and can't read them all, but Edmondson and Porter. And O. Henry, if you see him, he's on the front row. He's on the left, front row. Handsome man. Well, at that time, when he was a young man, he met a beautiful young woman. Her name was Ethel Estes. She was 19 years old, and he met her at the laying of the cornerstone at the Capitol building. She grew up in Austin, and her stepfather, Mr. Roach, he owned the local grocery store. He was a businessman, did quite well. And here we have a photograph of Ethel. This photograph was taken when she graduated from Austin High School. That is her graduation picture. He spied her at a ceremony that we had in Austin. We were getting a new state capitol building. The first capitol building burned. And he saw her and he thought she was just beautiful. He spied her in the group. And that evening, there was a dance. And she attended the dance with her friends. And she was wearing dimity. And years later, one of his friends in New York asked, well, why on earth do you put all of your heroines in dimity? And O. Henry replied, well, it was what Ethel and I could afford, and it was what Ethel wore at the time. So in New York, he later on put his women in dimity. He and Ethel married on July 1st, 1887, and they eloped to the home of the Reverend Dr. Richmond Kelly Smoot. He was the minister of the Central Presbyterian Church in Austin. And there is Reverend Smoot. He also started the Presbyterian Seminary. And this is the church where they attended. That's the Central Presbyterian Church. This is the home of Reverend Smoot in Austin. It's still standing today. His granddaughter, Miss Jane Smoot, still lives there. And this is the inside of the parlor where the Porters were married. They had a lot in common, he and Ethel. They were members of the Gilbert and Sullivan Society. They loved music and they loved dance. They loved the theater. And they performed at the Driscoll Hotel and at the Millet Opera House. This is the interior of the Millet Opera House in Austin. Today it's the Austin Club, but that was one of the early theaters. And here we have the Driscoll Hotel, built by a cattle baron. His last name is Driscoll. And if you look very carefully at the very top, you can see his bust. At the very top, he loved that. Colonel Driscoll. Oh, Henry's first job was at the General Land Office building. Now he was married and he had more responsibility, so he took a job at the General Land Office building as a draftsman. It just so happened that his friend, Richard Hall, was the land commissioner at the time, and O. Henry received the job. He was a very talented draftsman. He not only had a great way of reading the survey records, but he also illustrated his maps. He was a fantastic cartoonist, and he illustrated the maps that we have in Texas with cowboys and windmills and cacti and rattlesnakes and jackrabbits. So his maps are all animated, and even today in the land office, they're very unique. I think the land office today, they take real pride in knowing that O. Henry worked there. He was the only person at the land office who was allowed to do that, actually. Nobody else could get by with it. So his maps were really quite beautiful. And this is his drafting table. We have it on loan now at the O. Henry Museum. It actually belongs to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and it is on loan to us from them. But that is his drafting table. And here we have the inside of the General Land Office building. O. Henry is in the center. He is back row, and he's the second from the left. He loved the work at the land office. He was quite good at it, and he made many friends. However, his time there was really short. It was 4 years. He wanted to stay, but Richard Hall lost his bid as land commissioner. So he lost out, Richard Hall did, and when that happened, there was a big turnover at the General Land Office. The General Land Office building is the oldest state office building in Texas, and it's on the Capitol grounds, and they have many exhibits that are about O. Henry there. Well, losing his job at the General Land Office, everything started to fall apart. He went to work for the bank. He was the only bonded teller at the bank. He needed the banking position, though, to support his family. And he wanted to think about starting a new venture. He wanted to start a newspaper. So he was working at the bank day and night. And the bank, though, was ill-managed. It was started by a couple of brothers, Tom and Bob Brackenridge. Tom Brackenridge, he actually served in the Civil War, and he was a sheep rancher. Bob Brackenridge, he was a doctor. They set up the bank actually to support the sheep herding business in Texas, the sheep ranching business there. The bank was mismanaged. It went from one director to another, and after a while it did finally go out of business. While he was there were a lot of problems while O. Henry was there. And here we have a bank note from Mr. Burleson about the bank, $250. And if you look closely at the bottom it says William Sidney Porter, teller. Well, looking into the bank, though, the bank was not what he liked. His wife was not well. She was very sick with tuberculosis. And so Henry thought that maybe a trip to the Chicago World's Fair would do her some good. It was 1893, and she had the chance to go to the Chicago World's Fair. He had saved some money for her. But it wasn't exactly what she wanted to do. She wanted to stay home with her husband. She thought that her husband and her family and her home was more important to her than any trip she could ever have to the Chicago World's Fair. So she stayed home. And this is a photograph of Ethel and Margaret. And here's another baby picture of Margaret. And she stayed home and she bought some things for the house. She bought 2 wicker rocking chairs. She bought, and we have them today, those are the chairs. She bought a framed print of Bavaria, Germany. She also bought muslin curtains, and she bought some rugs. Years later, it was said that O. Henry was inspired by what she did for him and for their home. That was his inspiration for the gifts of the Magi. Well, he wanted to start the newspaper, but he didn't have any money. So he borrowed some money from some friends and his father-in-law to purchase a printing press and the rights to the newspaper to rent office space. And this is the little office building that he had on Congress Avenue. He changed the newspaper to the Rolling Stone, and it was an 8-page weekly. It featured his cartoons. It had a short story in it every week. The newspaper made fun of Austin folk and the German population, which didn't go over very well. It had stories in it like Tick-Tock, the story of the great French detective who solved the famous mystery of the robbery at the Driscoll Hotel. It also had the story called Behar Script, number 2692. It is the story of a young man who is murdered at the hands of a ruthless draftsman who swindles a young man and his widowed mother out of their land. So the setting is for the General Land Office. And the story was so well written and so well done that biographers later on said that that story that he wrote for the Rolling Stone, Behar Script, number 2692, that was probably the story that would tell the tale about what kind of writer O. Henry would someday be. Also, that story was so real that the land commissioner, when it came out, the land commissioner had to convince everyone that that was really not the way they did business at the General Land Office, that they were honest people, and that it was just fiction. So his stories, some of his stories in the Rolling Stone newspaper are pretty good, and some of them have been described as frivolous and meaningless. But one thing about it, his first biographer, Alphonso Smith, said that when O. Henry had the Rolling Stone newspaper, Alphonso Smith, who was a Poe professor at the University of Virginia and O. Henry's first biographer, he said that the Rolling Stone, what it did was, it actually made up O. Henry's mind about the fact that he wanted to write. So the Rolling Stone was good, very good about that. That was good for him. Here's the masthead of the Rolling Stone, and this one says, Austin, Texas, Saturday, August 25th, 1894. His motto is, out for the moss. And you can see those are his cartoons in the front that he drew. He did practically all of his own work. He did all of his own writing. He had a partner early on, but the partner left for Chicago, so Henry was alone. He did the writing, he did the editing, he sold ads, he did the cartoons, he wrote the short story, and he printed it at the little office building that we saw on the earlier slide. And here we have another Rolling Stone issue. This is a later one. This one says, Austin and San Antonio, Texas, Saturday, February the 2nd, 1895. Oh, Henry wasn't doing very well with the Rolling Stone in Austin, so he decided to take it to San Antonio, thinking that he might have a better readership. He had already kind of insulted the people, I think, the German population in Austin, so he was going to hope that he would do a little bit better in San Antonio. He was also very worried. He had borrowed heavily from his father-in-law. He had borrowed from friends at the General Land Office to make this thing a go. So he really needed for it to be a success, but it wasn't. Here's some more cartoons from the Rolling Stone. This one says, the one on the left says, a blind man went fishing one day, and he fished in a big field of hay, and he said, if by night I don't get a bite, I think I will go home and stay. And then on the right we have, there was an old tramp who passed by, asked a lady to give him some pie. And when she said no, the tramp, he said, oh, and would you mind telling me why? So he wrote limericks as well. He was also into limericks. Well, the Rolling Stone failed. He did quit his job at the bank. He quit his job at the bank when he found out that actually when there were problems at the bank. There were problems with his books. He was the only bonded teller at the bank. So a grand jury was formed on July 1895, and he stood trial for embezzlement charges of $5,654.20. It's a lot of money back then. The jury concluded, though, that the case was a no bill and the trial would be over. And the bank examiner, though, F.B. Gray, he was furious. He could not believe that it turned up to be a no bill. He accused District Attorney Culberson of leniency. He said the trial had been mishandled, and he was going to get another trial together. So the Porters, though, thinking that everything was fine, it was a no-bill trial, O. Henry was without a job, they soon moved to Houston. The Houston Post newspaper, they saw the Rolling Stone newspaper, and the owner of the Post really liked it. So Henry and his wife and daughter, they moved to Houston. This is Mr. Roach here. He borrowed heavily from Mr. Roach and Mr. Roach's grocery store. But the Roaches always believed in him. They always thought that, and Ethel, his wife, always believed that her husband would become a very well-known writer. She thought he had a tremendous talent. Here's some of the banknotes that he borrowed from Mr. Roach. One is for $2,800, and the other one is for $375. Actually, he borrowed it from R.S. Tenen. The top one is from R.S. Tenen. Well, they moved to Houston, and he went to work for the Houston Post, and his column was called Postscripts. He loved that job. It was a job that he really enjoyed. Ethel's health, though, was not good. They stuck with it, though. It was a good job, and they were very happy. This time, though, F.B. Gray was not going to the bank examiner was not going to let everything rest. So, Will Porter was summoned back to Austin to stand trial. Another jury was formed, and instead of coming back to Austin, though, O. Henry panicked. He thought that he would be surely convicted for a crime that he truly did believe that he didn't commit. So he ran away. He took the train to Hempstead, and from there he went to New Orleans, and then from there he went to Honduras. That just really made him guilty. And this is I won't read this, but this is a cartoon that he did for the Houston Post. This is the Alamo cartoon. He's making fun of the restoration of the Alamo. I put that in for curators. If you see in the front, you'll see the director with his hand out. The curator, he's got a hat. He's asking for 25 cents from the visitor. And look at all the workers all over the building. There's a poem that goes with it. Oh, Henry honestly thought the Alamo should just be left the way it was. And this is a photograph of the family. We have this photograph hanging in the house. This is Ethel and Margaret and O. Henry. She looks very sad there. That's the day she found out she had tuberculosis. And this is one of the last photographs that O. Henry had taken in Texas. Well, this time when O. Henry came back to stand trial, he was convicted on 2 counts. The total charges were $854.08. The other counts were thrown out. There continues to be debate concerning William Porter's innocence or guilt. Some have regarded his flight to Honduras as an admission of his guilt. Alfonso Smith said that O. Henry lost the case at Hempstead, Texas, not at Austin. Those thinking he was guilty questioned his apathy that he showed during the trial, his total lack of concern in asking his family and friends to not be present in court. This demonstrated a defeatist attitude on his part, they thought. His supporters, though, said that Will Porter did not have a chance because the bank examiner was out to get him, and to make an example of him. Supporters claimed that William Porter's attorneys were incompetent and he did not get a fair trial. However, the district attorney and his assistant, they were truly reluctant to prosecute him. They were looking at all the past instances at the bank and what was going on. Years later, Judge Truman E. O'Quinn, who was an associate justice of the Third Court of Appeals in Austin, Texas, had studied the case, and he concluded that 3 things convicted Porter, 3 factors. There was the chaos at the bank, the records from years past, the comptroller's decision to crack down on Texas banks and prevent a repetition of the Thornton case. And the last one was the question mark attached to his innocence because he fled to Honduras to avoid trial in July 1896. Today, depending upon what biography you read, O. Henry is either innocent or guilty. So he has definitely his supporters. Since there is not a transcript of the trial transcript was lost, we'll never know. We'll never know what happened. This is O. Henry as he entered prison. When he got to prison, they asked him, "What do you do?" The wardens asked, and O. Henry said, "Well, I'm a writer." And he said, "Well, we don't need writers here." He said, then O. Henry had the wherewithal to think of something. He was a licensed pharmacist. The very profession that he disliked was what saved him. That saved his life in prison. Thank goodness for that. So, he was the pharmacist during the night rounds. He would make his rounds at night, and while he was making his rounds, he was formulating these stories. And then after his rounds were over, he would go back to his room and he would write his stories. He wrote 12 stories in prison while he was in prison, and later on they were all accepted by the national magazines. The very first one he wrote was called Whistling Dick's Christmas Stocking. It's a Christmas story. It started out as Whistling Sam's Christmas Story, and then he changed it to Whistling Dick's Christmas Story. He wrote that story, and it was published by McClure's Magazine for December 1899. He was still in prison when it was published. Years later, one of his editors and a good friend asked him, Robert H. Davis said, "Why did you choose the pen name O. Henry?" O. Henry said, "Well, it looked good in print, and it is easy on the lips." He tried about 12 different pen names, and he did finally settle on O. Henry. These are some of the magazines that he wrote for, Munsey's and Everybody's Magazine. However, he wrote for about 26 different periodicals, including the Rolling Stone newspaper, including his own. Upon release from prison, he was released on July 24th, 1901. O. Henry went to Pittsburgh. The reason why is because he couldn't go back to Austin. By that time, Mr. and Mrs. Roach had moved away. They took Margaret with them to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Mr. Roach was the manager of the Iron Front Hotel there. O. Henry worked for the Dispatch when he arrived in Pittsburgh, the Dispatch newspaper. They couldn't pay him very much money, though. He had a lot of debts. He really was interested in paying Mr. Roach back. He was making a little bit of money. He tried to interest the Dispatch in some short stories, but they said, you need to move on to New York. These are really too good, and we can't afford you. So he didn't have a way to get to New York. He had no money. So he contacted Gilman Hall, who was the editor of Ainsley's magazine, and Gilman Hall advanced him $100. Gilman Hall waited a month. No Henry. This was in March. Waited another month. There was no Henry. And got kind of worried. Thought, oh boy, what are we in for? So he advanced him another $100, and O. Henry arrived. Years later, it was said that O. Henry was pretty nervous about his arrival in Gilman Hall's office because he didn't want Gilman Hall to think that he was some sort of a fly-by-night. But he was true to his word. And Gilman Hall and O. Henry became very good friends. This is Margaret after he was released from prison. Well, excuse me, she's a little bit younger there. That was taken probably while he was in prison. She never knew that he was in prison. He kept that from her. That was one reason they moved to Pittsburgh, the Roaches. I do have a letter that he wrote to her from prison. And this is what he says. Dear Margaret, I am busy all the time writing for the papers and magazines all over the country, so I don't have a chance to come home, but I'm going to try to come home this winter. If I don't, I will by summer for sure, and then you'll have somebody to boss and make trot around with you. Write me a letter whenever you have some time to spare, for I am always glad and anxious to hear from you. Hoping you are well and your finger is getting all right. I am with much love as ever, your Papa. Well, O. Henry made it to New York. Gilman Hall really became O. Henry's lifelong friend. Gilman Hall became O. Henry's confidant and friend and moneylender. And here we have a picture of Gilman Hall. Because of Gilman Hall, the O. Henry and his descendants, the O. Henry Museum has a fantastic collection of papers that Gilman Hall saved. The whole time he knew O. Henry, he saved everything O. Henry wrote, even down to the scraps of asking for money. And then in 1999, Gilman Hall's descendants gave that fantastic donation to the O. Henry Museum, made that donation to us, and we're just so proud to have it. Even though Henry's New York years were his most productive and prosperous, money was always elusive to him. Many of his letters to Gilman Hall requested loans or advances on a story. O. Henry, though, had a generous spirit. On the other hand, he was generous. He was so generous that he often did not have the funds to cover his own expenses. He was giving his money away. Gilman Hall wrote that, and this is something that Gilman Hall wrote, he said, I had seen him slide up to a derelict on a park bench and slip into his hand a $5 bill, all that he had at the time, not knowing where his next meal was coming from. He could never turn away a beggar without lending a helping hand, and if the man were in more urgent need of a coat than he himself, his coat would be transferred to the other's ownership. And that was truly O. Henry. And when you think about the gifts of the Magi, it makes sense that he would write that story, Gifts of the Magi, doesn't it? But O. Henry was also comical. O. Henry asked Gilman Hall so frequently for money that it became a joke. O. Henry wrote in a letter to Gilman Hall that is in the collection that we have, I want 2 soft-boiled eggs, some toast, and a baked potato. I have 21 cents. But $5 will be enough. Yours, Hungry Henry.
And here is a little more serious letter that he wrote to Gilman Hall. Dear Mr. Gilman Hall, and look how he puts Gilman Hall, all one word. He sounds very, very important, O. Henry does. Please, sir, don't couple me and them poor puns in print. Last call, siempre, S.P. Gilman Hall didn't know O. Henry was in prison, but to his very close friends, O. Henry would sign his name Sidney Porter or S.P. Now, if he was talking to someone who, and he did not know that person, he would sign his name O. Henry. Well, the magazine editors did champion his work because they knew he had quite a talent, and they knew that if his story went to print, it would sell. O. Henry was one of the biggest short story writers of his time. He was quite popular. Witter Benner, an editor for McClure's magazine, encouraged O. Henry to write his only novel, Cabbages and Kings. And here we have Cabbages and Kings, and it is a combination of all the stories that O. Henry wrote about Honduras. He combined those short stories, turned it into a novel, and it did quite well. Witter Benner was the editor of McClure's magazine, and McClure's, they were the people who published this book. It was published in 1904. Well, several years later, O. Henry had the thought to write another book. And his idea this time would be, it would take place in the South after the Civil War. It was a great project. He even entered into a contract with Collier's, but it never came to fruition. By that time, O. Henry's health was failing too. Well, through his disappointments, O. Henry kept close friends in New York. He especially enjoyed the company of Gilman Hall. Gilman Hall and his wife sometimes invited O. Henry to their home for meals, and O. Henry would join Gilman Hall for meals at New York restaurants. O. Henry loved New York. He loved New York so much. He would sit at the restaurants. And watch the people go by. He liked that more than anything. And as he watched them go by, he had a certain fascination about it all. He knew that he could put those people into his stories. And those people, they were his material for his stories. In 1905, O. Henry did marry again. He married again in 1907, but in 1905, he started corresponding with an old-time friend, Sarah Coleman, from Asheville, North Carolina. She started writing letters to him back and forth, and then finally she said, "Are you the same Will Porter that I knew?" And sure enough, he was. She came to visit him in New York, and they married on November the 27th, 1907. Gilman Hall was his best man. Another close friend was Richard Duffy, who was the co-editor at Ainsley's with Gilman Hall. Richard Duffy and O. Henry would take walks to Madison Square, which was O. Henry's favorite New York place, Madison Square. Anne Partland was another one of his friends. She also wrote short stories, but she worked as a clerk. And her father was in the working class. He worked with iron and steel. Started out as a blacksmith. And Anne Partland wrote short stories about the working class, and she befriended O. Henry, and she was even with him the night that he died. Well, humor sustained O. Henry through his disappointments. Humor is evident in his short stories. If you were his friend, he called you Bill or Colonel. He sometimes called Margaret Bill. Most of the time he called Margaret Bill. She often thought he didn't know her name, Margaret. And then he would call Gilman Hall Gigi. And then, of course, O. Henry's most famous humorous story is The Ransom of Red Chief. It was published for the Saturday Evening Post for July the 6th, 1907. It is a fine example of humor in O. Henry's short stories, and it's also a great example of O. Henry used the element of the tall tale. Throughout his stories, if you read them, sometimes you'll catch a glimpse of the tall tale in his short stories. It's the story about two thieves, Sam and Bill, who kidnap a local boy only to pay the boy's father $250 to take the kid back. You know, I've known children like that. I've known adults like that. It is a favorite story that is read in classrooms today, and I think it almost rivals Gifts of the Magi in popularity. But another famous writer liked The Ransom of Red Chief, Booth Tarkington. That was Booth Tarkington's favorite O. Henry story. By 1909, I was going to show you these, and I'll read this real quick. It says, Kaiserfish is not a man to quibble over trifles. The Kaiser sent him here to get 100,000 rifles. His name is Herr Kaiserfish. He looks like a fish. You have to think about when O. Henry did this cartoon. It was prior to World War I. O. Henry loved history. He loved the dictionary. He loved words. He loved the newspaper. Here's another little cartoon that he wrote. There never was a man like this, nor will there be another. Though that I couldn't do one, but I really hadn't rather. Well, by 1909, Harry Peyton Stigger, O. Henry's literary advisor at Doubleday Page and Company, began in earnest to publish O. Henry's short stories in book form. The book sets would consist of 12 volumes. The second volume of the set, the 4 million, contained Gifts of the Magi. Stager hoped that the sale of the books would make it possible for O. Henry to repay all of his debts to Doubleday Page and Company. To promote the O. Henry books, Stager convinced O. Henry to be interviewed and to be photographed. That was not something that O. Henry wanted to do. He consented to have the interview, but the interview gave little factual information about O. Henry's life. He completely omitted prison, of course, and he just mentioned Austin. So the interview is the only one he gave, and for the most part, it wasn't factual. The photographs went a little bit better. This was one of the ones that he had photographed. It was difficult though. It took 6 hours just to get him dressed and to walk 2 blocks down to the studio for the photograph. And then the photographer, Vanderweed, had to convince him that everything was really all right. Let's get comfortable here. So here we have O. Henry. These are some of the photographs. Here's another one. After the photographs were made and after O. Henry saw the proofs, he said, hey, these are pretty good. It was not as bad as going to the dentist. O. Henry really did appreciate the kindness of his friends. He did. He loved his friends. And here's a book, Whirligigs. This came out of this was one of the 12-volume sets that Doubleday published. This was what all of the photographs were about. This is one of 12. But O. Henry did love his friends, and he did appreciate what they did for him. And in this book, he inscribed it to Gilman Hall. To Gilman Hall, Esquire, as an inadequate voucher of appreciation of his earliest encouragement and interest, his subsequent encouragement and aid, and his ultimate encouragement and friendship of and for O. Henry. That came from the Gilman Hall's descendants. Harry Peyton Stigger was O. Henry's literary advisor at Doubleday, and he also lived across the hall from O. Henry at the Caledonia Hotel. When O. Henry died on June 3rd, 1909, Harry Peyton Stigger assisted Gilman Hall and William Griffith with the funeral arrangements. And O. Henry's will named Stigger as Margaret Porter's legal guardian. Margaret Worth Porter went to Belmont College. in Nashville in 1905. O. Henry always wished that his daughter would have a good education. It was important to him. He funded her $1,000 per month for her expenses. That was a lot of money back then. Margaret even tried her hand at writing. She wasn't successful like her dad, though. But she did sell a couple of short stories, and to her father, he was so proud. He was actually sporting a stick pen that she gave him from a sale of one of her books. She loved her father dearly. Well, quickly, I'm going to go through these slides, but first of all, I want to say quickly, I know we're running out of time, so I'll quickly say a few things about the gifts of the Magi. What do the scholars say about the gifts of the Magi? Eugene Current Garcia, he states that the gifts of the Magi illustrates O. Henry's own personal suffering. Garcia also notes that the story provides an insight of New Yorkers at home. O. Henry has said, this is what O. Henry said, "I would like to live a lifetime in each street in New York. Every house has a drama in it. Though the story is really quite simple, Gifts of the Magi, it is still popular today." Garcia goes on to write that it is unselfish love shared, regardless of the attendant difficulties and distractions of married life. This is the idea repeatedly implied as a criterion in his fictional treatment of domestic affairs. Dr. Gerald Langford, who was a professor of English at the University of Texas, he wrote the book Alias O. Henry, and he says that O. Henry's portrayal of the course of, it is the O. Henry portrayal of the course of true love. Consistently, marriage is portrayed not as the complicated actuality which Porter himself had experienced, but as a simplified state of sacrificial devotion which might have reflected the mind of the sentimental bachelor. So when O. Henry was the sentimental bachelor living in New York, he reflected on that simple bit of love, that sacrificial love. That was his ideal of marriage. That was O. Henry's ideal of marriage. So, from 1910 to 1930s, his stories reached high popularity and then they waned. O. Henry could never agree which was his very best favorite story. He didn't have a favorite. But I will quickly say one thing about O. Henry at the end of his life, and then we'll go finish with these slides. Gilman Hall wrote a paper about O. Henry at the end of after O. Henry passed away, and this is what O. Henry said about Gilman Hall. Gilman Hall said, "Joy came to him, O. Henry, the great joy of work fulfilled. Money came to him. To be sure, he never kept it. Financially, those years must have been an agony to him. But as I look back on them, I realize that he had many of the things he wanted. Life was full to him. Yes, I'm sure joy crept into his heart. Friends came, true friends. Contentment often sat at his side. Honor slowly approached, and in the last years of his life came straight to him." Now quickly I'll just go over these photographs. This is the O. Henry Museum before it was moved at its original location. Here we have the house moved to its present location today. It cost $250 to move it and to restore it back in 1934. This is the house in 1934 after its move. Austin was very proud. It's one of the first museums in Austin, actually. This is the O. Henry Museum today. This is where I work. Very different from the Flagler Museum, but I love it just the same. hall, very different from the entry hall here. But I love it just the same. And let me take you to our parlor. This is our parlor. You'll notice in the corner on the right, that's Apple's piano. That's the piano where she took piano lessons. This is the piano. It's inlaid mother of pearl, the keys are ivory. It's a 1860 box brand. This is their bedroom suite. Actually, that was their bedroom furniture that they received from Mr. and Mrs. Roach. It's a 3-piece set, bed, dresser, and washstand, commode. This is O. Henry's hat from New York. It was donated to the museum in the 1960s. From the theater. And here we have the dining room. And if you look closely, you'll see Margaret's doll furniture. Margaret left her doll furniture behind, and her grandmother said, maybe someday we can retrieve it. Well, it didn't get back to her home, didn't it? And this is the kitchen. So this is the photograph of O. Henry, and I hope that you have some insight now to why he wrote Gifts of the Magi and why it's probably one of the most popular short stories today. Thank you again for having me.
Tell us how popular Gift of the Magi was in his own lifetime and what effect it had on his career, if any?
Well, he wrote the Gift of the Magi to deadline. It did well. It really wasn't what made him popular, though. What made O. Henry popular were the Doubleday books, the 12 books, the gift sets. Those were what made O. Henry popular. But O. Henry was actually popular even before that. He was writing for the magazines. He started writing for the magazines when he got to New York, and the magazines were popular. That was their entertainment. Instead of television, people would wait for the next week for the magazine to come out. O. Henry was paid $100 a week by the New York World newspaper for, he was under contract for a short story every week. Pretty good money back then. And of course, the New York World, that was the newspaper that published Gifts of the Magi. So he was doing well with the New York World, but at the time he was writing for the New York World and was under contract with them, he was also freelancing for other newspapers. Saturday Evening Post, the Smart Set, Cosmopolitan, Everybody's Magazine, and Ainsley's. So he was writing, sometimes he was writing 3 and 4 short stories a week. One year, he wrote 28 short stories in 1 year, making an income of $14,000. That was the most income he ever made in a year, and he was exhausted. That was in 1908. More questions? Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I missed it, but did he pay back his loans to Roaches and everybody else?
He did, actually. All the royalties went to them. That was in his will to Margaret. Well, actually, all the royalties went to Margaret. And Margaret, in the will, it was promised that Margaret would pay back the Roaches. And they were. Years later, the Roaches moved back to Austin, Texas. They had other daughters living in Texas, and so they came back, and they were repaid, but I'm sure there were other people down the road that were not repaid. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I missed this too, but what happened to his first wife?
His first wife outlived him. She loved Asheville, and she kept, even though they married, she kept her home in Asheville, North Carolina, and he lived there for a while, but the solitude got to him. He missed New York, so he kept his place in New York. They would visit back and forth, and she was not with him when he died. She was with him just a few days or a week or so before he died, though. He had made the trip to North Carolina and came back and was very ill, and he died there.
I think I'm confused. Is that his second wife you're talking
Second
about?
wife.
I'm
Oh, I'm sorry. His first wife died. His first wife died of tuberculosis right before the trial. She died. They had been married 10 years, and she died of tuberculosis. Sorry, I didn't explain. I apologize to you for that. He died of a complication of cirrhosis of the liver, diabetes. He loved cigars, bourbon, chocolate cake, steaks, slathered in butter. Yes.
What kind of material is dimity?
Dimity is kind of a cotton, and it's a printed material. It was not very expensive, and it was a popular material of the time. It was just a little cotton dress.
Question all the way at the back.
Yes.
There's a very famous tavern in New York City.
Yes.
Now, Henry used that's where we particularly stayed.
Yeah, Pete's Tavern.
Right.
Pete's Tavern is in New York City. It's down in Irving Place. Oh, Henry, when he moved to Irving Place, Washington Irving, he looked up and he was just fascinated the fact that he was actually going to live in Irving Place. And Pete's Tavern is very close to Irving Place. Yes.
And there's a plaque there that says in a certain booth,
Yes.
he wrote the gift of the man.
Well,
I don't know whether that's fact.
that's kind of up for grabs. We don't really know about that for sure. The editors say that he wrote it in his flat, that O. Henry wrote it in his flat, but there's a lot about O. Henry that we really don't know because he never gave a decent interview. Yes.
How old was Margaret when she went to live with the Roaches, and why did O. Henry entrust them to take care of her?
Well, his own mother had passed away when he was 3, and his father, who was a very prominent doctor, also had a drinking problem, and I believe he had already passed away at that time. The Roaches were Apple's mother and stepfather, and Apple had passed away. So Margaret was 10 years old when her father went to prison, and it just seemed likely that she would live with Mr. and Mrs. Roach. Are there any other questions? Yes.
When you recounted his time in prison,
Yes.
he was a pharmacist.
Yes.
He didn't make his rounds. He said he went back to his room.
He went back to, yes, he was a trustee.
So he didn't have a cell.
He didn't have a cell. He was a trustee. The prison officials had great respect for him. As a matter of fact, the prison doctor said that O. Henry did all of his work responsibly and had a lot of respect for William Sidney Porter. Yes.
I'm sorry.
How long was he actually in prison?
3 years and 3 months, but the sentence was for 5 years.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a question online.
Yes.
Our online reviewer would like to know if O. Henry ever wrote about Henry Flagler or about Palm Beach.
Henry Flagler or Palm Beach? No, not to my knowledge. I don't know of any stories that have a setting in Florida. He did do a cartoon, though, about Standard Oil that we have at the museum. And you have to understand, O. Henry made fun of everyone, but in this cartoon he says, I'm doing an oil painting in Standard Oil. And O. Henry loved New York, and a lot of people say that he wrote about the common man, which is true. He did write about the common man, and that's why he's so revered in Russia and in China, because he wrote about the common man. But what a lot of people don't understand is that he also loved to mix and talk to people of wealth. And he wrote stories about people of wealth, and he did believe in capitalism, truly did. Madison Square was his favorite place. All that area down there, that's where he wanted to be. He loved the theater. He loved to be with people. He loved the newspapers. So, all right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate that. It was great. Learned a lot. I had no idea Henry began by writing for Rolling Stone. That was a really big shocker for me. Makes sense in a funny sort of way. And did he really go off to the Columbian Exposition without his wife?
No, his wife, he was hoping that his wife would go on a trip.
Oh, so he didn't end up
He was
going.
going to stay home, he was working at the bank.
Got it. Okay, great. Somehow it sounded like the Columbian Expedition might be responsible for inspiration for the gift of the Magi. And for those of you who know me and my obsession with the Columbian Exposition, you know I'd latch onto that in a heartbeat. It's interesting, too, that his wife had tuberculosis, a common ailment at the time. Many people succumbed to tuberculosis, and of course that's how Henry Flagler was introduced to Florida when the doctor suggested that his wife come to Florida to recover from her tuberculosis, which she was not able to do, but Henry Flagler's interest in Florida was maintained, and of course he ended up inventing modern Florida. Well, thank you for that lecture. Thank you to all of you for attending today. The festivities related to the tree lighting have begun. I hope you'll stay and enjoy those festivities, which culminate at 4:45 with the lighting of the tree. And I hope you'll join us for other programs you see here in the season program guide throughout this, the end of this year and this coming year. And we wish you all the best for the holiday season. And many thanks to Harris Private Bank for making this possible. Thank you.